Hey everyone, welcome to my studio. Welcome to 300,000 miles and 17 years. I just want to talk real quick about what you're going to see in this video. First off, in the early years I didn't shoot video. All I shot was stills, so that's all I have to document the early years of ownership of this Jeep Wrangler. And speaking about ownership of the Jeep Wrangler, the video actually precedes that a little bit. During the video, it'll talk some about the F-150 pickup truck and what my kid and I were doing with that F-150 pickup truck that was somewhat consistent with overlanding and the definition that most of the world uses for that word. But it is about more than the Wrangler. It's about my journey because of the Wrangler, and some of my journey occurred because of the Wrangler. Didn't directly involve the Wrangler. For example, if we had a event where we were doing a mod on somebody else's vehicle, I might talk about that. And that doesn't really directly involve my Wrangler, except I met that individual because I have this wonderful, amazing vehicle. Now, what the video is not about is, this is not a replacement for trip videos. The segments you're going to see about each trip or whatever are very short. And so if there is something that piques your interest, you say, well, I'd sure like to see more about that, let me know in the comments. I'd be glad to point you out what the playlist or the single video is that would answer those questions for you. So, on with the show. In February 2007, I picked up my brand spanking new 2007 Jeep Wrangler X, what would in later years come to be called a Sport. The four-door Wranglers were a new thing, having been released just a few months earlier, so there was a lot of ridicule of Jeep for that at that time. However, over the years, the four-door Wrangler sales overwhelmed those of two doors, where today roughly 6 and 7 Wrangler sales are four-door models. And this has moved the Wrangler from being a great rock crawler to the world of overlanding, which would soon start becoming much more popular. But my youngest kid and I started off wandering a local lake, shooting still photos of our new pride and joy. And I will say I loved driving this vehicle way more than any other I had owned in my, at that time, 4 decades of driving. Even though my kids shared truthfully that they had more hours driving it off-road than I did, since I was always shooting photos of our adventures. And that worked well with our goal of the previous 10 years with my F-150 pickup to camp, hike, backpack, paddle bike, and now off-road all of the lower 48 U.S. national parks. And we would make it a point to drive back roads between destinations as much as possible. For us, the trip was the adventure. We enjoyed learning the human and natural history of the areas we traveled, meeting new people, trying new foods, and the simple experience of being away from the busyness of interstate travel. We traveled places along what William Least Heat Moon might call blue highways for their color on old Rand McNally road atlases. By April, we had met a lot of fellow Jeepers, and especially owners of what was then the new JKs. We'd spend time at the local lake exploring the trails around it, and sometimes working on our recovery skills. This year, we'd take the Jeep on trails in Sedona, Moab, and Canyonlands National Park, while still doing a lot of hiking and backpacking at Yosemite, Lassen Peak, Redwoods, and Crater Lake National Parks. We were having a ton of fun. It's a Jeep thing you wouldn't understand started to make a lot of sense. It could go so many more places than my two-wheel drive pickup. But by December of that year, we were headed with a group we'd met in an online forum to Disney, Oklahoma. I made a new friend, Jeff, who was a highly experienced off-roader and would teach me a lot of what I now know. But being influenced by a larger group meant the mods had begun. Quick disconnects for the front sway bar and rock rails, mostly protect my precious new toy from parking lot dings. And we were still on stock tires. Soon it was time to replace the wheels and upgrade to 33-inch tires and a small lift. I also installed an appropriate front bumper and winch. And and added a little bit of overlanding jewelry. This year's vacation was to San Diego to visit my folks, and it snowed in the Laguna Mountains while we were there, so naturally we had to take the Jeep up into the mountains. We'd rescued 3 vehicles that slid off the road, all easily done with a quick tug or just a couple extra pair of hands. But proof positive that if there is one thing San Diegans don't know how to do, it is drive on snow and ice. After our return to Oklahoma, we'd head back to Disney, where we managed to damage the hardtop and destroy one new tire and bend the drag link. This rock crawling was proving to be a rather expensive endeavor. But that didn't stop me from traveling to Easter Jeep Safari and enjoying trails such as Baby Lion's Back, Fins and Things, Poison Spider Mesa, and White Rim Road. Shortly after that, my kid and I would take our annual vacation, which would include running Fins and Things again, as well as Tower Arch Trail in Arches National Park, Water Pocket Fold in Capitol Reef National Park, and camping the entire trip. There was also some time in Tucson where we'd enjoy a steak dinner at Pinnacle Peak. Later that year, my friend Minaj and his family and I would join up with a group in Clayton, Oklahoma to try out a few new trails and get a little practical experience with winching. Early in 2010, I had to replace my EGR valve, which was generating a check engine light. I wrote up the replacement procedure that many folks have found online when replacing their own. But I also received my aftermarket rear bumper, which included a tire swing gate and jerry can and trail racks. That meant I could move my high lift to the swing gate and install new Overlander jewelry up front. I had e-lockers installed and the differentials re-geared to 488. Now I was ready for overlanding. I invited my longtime friend Ray to join me, and we headed with Jeff and his friend Ron to Moab. There we'd drive Fins and Things, Elephant Hill Trail, and then spend 3 days on White Rim Road. This year's vacation with my kid to national parks was in the Northeast, where they were on an internship at Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute in New York. Although there'd be no off-road travel, we'd hike to the top of a Cadillac Mountain in Acadia National Park, and I'd take in some of the typical tourist spots along the way. Later in the year, I'd drive out to San Diego to visit my parents, and along the way drive Schnebley Hill Road to Sedona, and drive up to Kitt Peak Observatory near Tucson. '11 started off with a bang. That is, we held a large event at the lake near my home and I managed to rip off a fender getting too close to a tree. Fortunately, one of the participants, Rick, had replaced his fenders and gave me his old one to install on my Jeep. This would not be the first time that happened. By now, my home had become a regular place for modding folks' Jeeps, and one Hummer too. First, it was a lift on Minaj's Jeep. Then later chases, followed by a quick run to the lake to see how things were working on it. And a chance to show off my newly installed overhead rack and lights, which weren't actually wired up yet. And finally Rick's, who had given me that fender, the first one. He still had 3 more in his attic. But it wasn't just modification chores this year. In June I would meet my oldest daughter and her family, who lived near Tucson, in Moab. And we'd run Fins and Things, Tower Arch Trail, and White Rim Road down into Lathrop Canyon, at least as far as we could go since the Colorado River was flooding the canyon. In July, I'd visit with the rest of my kids, meeting my other daughter and son and their families in Blue Ridge, Georgia. And my youngest, who was now at Georgia Tech on an internship, would also join us. Then the two of us would head to nearby Congaree National Park. Another trip without any significant off-road travel, but still hitting spots worth visiting. In August, Ray would join me again and we'd head to Colorado, visiting several national parks, including driving over Medno Pass to Great Sand Dunes, and then across Engineers and Imogene Passes. Closing out the year in December, I would stop in Tucson to visit with my oldest daughter, and we'd drive up Mount Lemmon. We'd take the paved way up, but it was a bit of a challenge due to heavy snow. However, when the highway patrol officer at the bottom looked at my rig, he told me I looked prepared for the conditions and let me pass. 2012 started off with another Jeep run at the lake near my home, and I managed to get high-centered. My clutch throb bearing was also making a bit of noise, so a group of friends volunteered to help me replace it and the clutch, and James volunteered his business shop for the work. Of course, he knew how I ran my rig, so insisted that I belly wash it first. James also gave me a trasharoo and asked that I take a few photos of it during an upcoming trip. In February, Jeff helped me to install dual batteries in my Wrangler. I was building out the rear end with a fridge, plus wanted the assurance in the event of a battery failure. And James hosted a large mod party at his business shop. During that rig, built a temporary harness to power my overhead lights, something to get me by until I came up with a permanent answer. After that, I received a call that someone was stuck at the lake near my house. "Can you recover them?" I went out and used the winch to yank them out. Then, while backing up to leave, managed to bang up my rear trail rack a little. But James is a skilled fabricator and fixed it up like new. In March and April, I organized a group of friends from Oklahoma to head west to drive the Mojave Road. On the way, we'd hit some serious winter weather. We'd spend one night in Canyon de Chelly, back when it was permitted to drive one's own rig. The weather closed down I-40, so we turned south to bypass it, finally arriving in Nevada to begin the Mojave Road. This would be my first trip shooting video, and that shows in the quality of video I shot, ignoring that I never thought to shoot any of my rig. Departing there, I'd head to the Seattle area where Ray lived to help him modify his newly purchased 2012 Wrangler. On the way home, my clutch slice cylinder would fail. Luckily, I made it to a Jeep dealer in Pendleton, and they quickly had me rolling again. Later in April, a group of us would run the High Water Mark Trail in Arkansas. It was during this trip that a small branch poking into a narrow trail would do some serious damage to the passenger side of my Jeep. I'd have a body shop repair it, but got another one of those take-off fenders from my friend Rick. By April 2012, Ray was ready to take his new Wrangler on an overlanding adventure. So we secured a permit to camp at Toro Weep in Grand Canyon National Park, and I headed out. As usual, I'd stop at a few places during the drive, including the ghost town of Cuervo and El Malpais National Monument in New Mexico, and Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. After that, Ray and I would meet and head the 60-plus miles to Toro Weep on the edge of the Grand Canyon. We were racing a storm to arrive and get camp set up. But the next day was beautiful as we headed to Sedona, where we would drive Schnebly Hill Road and Soldier Creek Pass. Then we surprised my daughter in Tucson with a visit. We'd spend a couple days there, driving the back way up Mount Lemmon. Next, we headed to California and stayed with my folks. We didn't do any off-roading there, but the highlight of that part of the trip was an all-day photography excursion in the back of a large truck into the containment areas at the San Diego Zoo Safari Park. In October, a few friends from Oklahoma and Texas would gather at Big Bend National Park. Despite incoming foul weather, we'd explore Old Ore Road, River Road, Mariscal Mine, Black Gap Road, and the Chishol's Basin.
How about a little toast?
Living the dream.
There you go. All right.
Come November, another trip to California. This time I'd stop at Carlsbad Caverns National Park and Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. In California, I'd drive Campo Road that runs near the border with Mexico. Throughout the year, there would be other weekend events, including a run of the K-Trail, a recovery and a follow-up weekend in the quicksand-filled Canadian River, and 2 weekend runs through the San Boys Mountains near Kenta, Oklahoma, the first being a very wet, dry run for us the second weekend. And those runs of the Canadian River destroyed both of my unit bearings, one of my chromoly axle shafts, and its U-joint, as the quicksand made its way past the seals. I would do a couple other mods during the year, including installing a Nexus 7 Android tablet for various tasks, such as topo mapping, and installing the extension of the overhead rack, modified by James to accommodate my snorkel. One fascinating sight was an ice storm when Brandy, James, and I went to the local lake to capture a few shots of the frozen scenery. In February 2013, we tackled the K-Trail once again. This would be the last time before we learned that the more challenging western section of the trail was officially closed.
What you driving about?
I said I kept trying to sleep while we were going down the road.
Yeah, doing a pretty good job of it too.
In April, James and I were headed to meet his wife to catch a movie, and were witness to an EF5 tornado rampage.
Yeah, we're way too close together here, go. Yep, here it comes.
Meanwhile, I was making more friends outside of Oklahoma, and we were planning some excellent adventures. And the first of these was from Ridgeway, Colorado to the north rim of Grand Canyon National Park, including 4 days on White Rim Road. It was an incredible adventure spanning 9 days and over 400 off-road miles.
And take this House Rock Valley Road bypass down to 89A, which will take us into the Grand Canyon.
Awesome.
Yep.
In June, I drive out to California again, and as per my usual habit when off-roading is not a part of the trip, I'd still travel a lot of two-lane highways in search of interesting experiences. One memorable experience was in San Diego when I was shooting some of the art under the bridge over the bay to Coronado. The painter of that work happened by and asked what I was doing. I explained, and he invited me to visit his studio on a barge under the bridge. He is Salvador Torres, a well-known artist and advocate for the Hispanic community in California. I'd also spend some time in Imperial Beach, which is a popular surfing spot near the Mexican border. On the way home, I'd once again drive Campo Road along the border, stop at the Desert View Tower in the mountains above Imperial Valley, and explore White Sands National Park in New Mexico. In October, we'd run the High Water Mark Trail in Arkansas again. We called it F-Stop Arkansas because the focus was photography. Okay, that pun was intended. Ray would join me from Washington once more.
What do we got there, Chris?
Some nice St. Louis ribs.
All right. Those look really like they're going to be good.
In November, I'd head back to California and once again take in a few sites along the way, including the Mining Museum in Grants, New Mexico, in Arizona, the Petrified Forest National Park, Montezuma Well National Monument, and Saguaro National Park. And in San Diego, the Midway Aircraft Carrier. The final event of 2013 was a trip with Matt to Big Bend Ranch State Park and the adjacent National Park. The weather forecast was ominous, with snow and ice predicted. Confluence of the two is right there at the mouth of the canyon. We'd also explore along Hen Egg Road north of Terlingua. During the year, I'd install an S-Pod to clean up the wiring for various electrical mods, and I'd add an engine oil pressure gauge, something the 2007 JKs were missing. I'd also have to replace the water pump, and notice some worn wiring installation of the alternator that I would upgrade.
Come in. Over the fenders here.
2014 started right off with another trip to Arkansas, this time to the Buckhorn OHV area, which was open to full-size rigs back then.
So what temperature was it?
It was like 16 degrees this morning. I've never seen a propane bottle freeze like it's while you're cooking. That's how cold it is. They had to put a new bottle on there just been cooked.
There would be a lot of work in February and March, including new ball joints and replacing the PCV valve. That PCV valve was a lot more difficult than it sounds, taking my biggest friend at the time, Wiley, and a long pry bar to get it out. I'd also design and hook up the engine fan to the S-Pod so I could turn it off during water fords. And I'd install cables to recharge batteries and power additional accessories. But the big improvement was to rework the cargo area of the Jeep to permanently mount the fridge on a slide and to add a storage drawer and a shelf. James had the tools needed for that job, and Ray helped since he was in town for an upcoming trip with me to New Mexico. For that trip, we'd meet up with Matt and Chris at Socorro, then head to Magdalena, where we'd first stop at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory Very Large Array Visitor Center. Then we'd head across the plain to San Agustin, looking for our first night to camp. As we were preparing to set up camp, Ray and I realized that we had left the tent poles back in Oklahoma. Fortunately, we had lots of rope, and for your viewing pleasure, when we arrived at the campsite, I had forgotten to stop the GoPro from recording.
So what's going on, man?
So we were going to have to turn around. We were headed up that road there, and the snow started piling up, and it got about 14 inches deep.
In May, I'd be on a trip to California again and decided that I'd spend some time, mostly by myself, exploring Arizona. But I started first with a visit to El Malpais National Monument in New Mexico. Then I'd drive through the western district of Saguaro National Park. Next, I'd drive Ajo Way through the Tohono O'odham Nation to Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. During the drive, I picked up a Native American walking along the road through the desert. It was interesting talking to him. Once there, I'd explore the park, including securing a permit for Puerto Blanco Drive. I'd especially enjoy the rare sight of organ pipe cacti blooms. Heading north, I'd next drive Schnebly Hill Road down to the town of Sedona.
I know you.
You do?
From JK Forum.
I am on JK Forum. Now you can tell everybody where I'm at.
Next, I'd meet my friends Gary and Sandra, and having secured a permit from the Navajo Nation, we'd spend the night camped at Tatahatsu Point above Grand Canyon National Park. From there, they would head to Flagstaff to attend Overland Expo.
Well, Sandra, that is quite a view you've got from your kitchen there, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, right.
While I'd head to Monument Valley. And then the next day to Canyon de Chelly, where entry into the park's canyons in one's own vehicle was no longer allowed. In September, I'd replace the clutch master cylinder because it was squeaking. It would be an unexpectedly difficult task, and of course, the fix was only temporary. That squeak would be a continual off and on problem in my Jeep, and those of many others. Once again, I'd write up the procedure that many others would find online to replace it. In June and July would be another family trip to Georgia. Once again, though, there wasn't much in the way of off-road travel. I'd take advantage of the trip to explore a few areas. These would include Wapanaka National Wildlife Refuge, where I'd get caught breaking camp in some truly severe weather. The roads were flooded, and that would lead to a notable problem later. At the Shiloh National Cemetery, I'd noticed it seemed like I was followed by a lot of chirping birds. I'd continue on the Natchez Trace, finding an old section of the route. I'd end up at Great Smoky Mountains National Park before I figured out what all the squeaking was. It was my aftermarket front drive shaft. I did not realize that there was a hidden grease joint on it. I pulled the drive shaft off and continued my trip. I'd end up sending it back to the manufacturer for repair. No OKC shops had the special tools to do the work. In October was another trip to the Big Bend region. Ray would fly down and join me as we met up with James, Matt, Chris, and Tom. We started off at Big Bend Ranch State Park, this time driving the road to nowhere. We checked out Bouncing Rocks and the Contrabando movie set before we drove a bit along Hen Egg Road, then headed over to the national park. There we'd drive Old Maxwell Road, River Road, Black Gap Road, and into Chisholm's Basin. While in the national park, we'd happen upon a fellow who was hiking back to pavement due to a flat tire. We'd give him a lift back to his camp and take care of his rig's problem. On the way back to OKC, Ray and I would stop at Carlsbad Caverns. In November and December, I'd be invited by a volunteer at Anza Borrego Desert State Park to check that out with him as my guide. On the drive to San Diego, I'd stop at White Sands Missile Range Museum and the National Park to shoot a few photos. Once in California, I'd meet Fred. He'd lead me out to the Sandstone Canyon, Vaughn's Point, Chariot Canyon, and give me directions to Coyote Canyon. I'd be fascinated by the metal sculptures scattered around Borrego Springs. We'd also meet up with Tom, who would guide us up Carrizo Mountain. Afterward, I'd visit my daughter, a student at Rice University in Houston. Another trip without off-roading, but we'd enjoy visits to the university, downtown, the Museum of Natural History, Houston Space Center, and the Battleship Texas. By the time 2015 rolled around, interest in overlanding was picking up around the country. James and I had quite a few folks around the local area asking about how to get into it. So he and I arranged a one-day event at his shop in January to teach the basics, camping and rig gear in use. We dubbed it Central Overland Expo. The weather was foul, so we held the event indoors. And of course, there was plenty of food cooked camp style. On another January weekend, we'd have a day working on Jeeps, installing a snorkel on one, and fabricating and installing a second spare tire carrier for mine. In March, I rewired my S-Pod light switch to turn the entire S-Pod off and rewired the S-Pod lighting into the dash lighting dimmer. I also replaced the toggles with improved ones. Later in March, I was contacted by Travis, the park manager at Roman Nose State Park. Travis also owned a Jeep and had watched my YouTube videos. He invited me to photograph the Cheyenne winter count, an annual census tradition of that Indian nation. It was fascinating listening to the stories sold and wisdom shared while sitting around a small campfire in a genuine buffalo hide teepee. In May, Matt would ask Chris, Ray, and me along for a trip to Utah. We would meet up and drive through Valley of the Gods, visit Gooseneck State Park, and drive up Moki Dugway to enter Canyonlands Maze District from the access point near Hyde on Lake Powell. We'd spend several days in the park, the highlight being our campsites at Maze Overlook.
You forgot the Happy Mother's Day message.
Oh, Happy Mother's Day too from everybody here.
Departing there, we'd drive to Goblin Valley, then Cathedral Valley Loop and Capitol Reef National Park. Parting our campsite above Cathedral Valley, I'd catch a limb on my overhead rack supports and break the rear passenger door glass. We covered that with a plastic bag and duct tape. Then we proceeded to our next planned camp along Smoky Mountain Road when a thunderstorm came by, soaking the road surface and making it as slippery as gumby grease.
This stuff is slippery.
We decided to visit Bryce Canyon National Park, then retire to Page, Arizona. Departing the next morning for home, I made a quick stop to shoot Horseshoe Bend at sunrise. During the Utah trip, Ray had noticed that my tire swing gate had a lot of play as I drove along. It turned out to be a cracked bracket. Upon return home, James welded on a couple gusses to strengthen the bracket. In the period June through November, I took 4 day trips from my home for the sole purpose of shooting a few photos. Most of these were non-eventful. But in June, when I had planned to go photograph some birds at the lake near my home, well, that was more interesting. Fortunately, I always carry my pull paddle and winch controller. It took me 3 pulls to free myself from the muck I got myself into. In July, I'd head to Washington State to meet up with some online friends to run the Washington Backcountry Discovery Route. Along the way, I'd find a few side trips, the most interesting of which was a drive up Old Fall River Road in Rocky Mountain National Park. The trip group included Ray, plus Tad, Guy, BJ, Brian, Jack, Callie, and Russell. I would enjoy future adventures with all of them. The views along the way were fantastic, though the last few days were rather smoky. But the descent to near Lake Chelan through an optional route called the Jungle was the one we'd share the most stories about.
Okay, there's a log laying alongside the trail to the left.
Yeah, I got 2 and 2 together there.
Hello, birthday boy.
Departing the U.S.-Canadian border where the Wobbler ends, I'd drive 2-lane highways to meet James and a few friends along with a professional film crew at Lake Powell to shoot a video for James's business. I had a lot of interesting experiences, but the best was being the only fair crossing on the Lake Powell ferry. Captain Marilyn invited me to the wheelhouse. It was fascinating talking to her. Once James and crew arrived, I'd advised them of places to shoot in Utah and then follow them into Colorado. It was great to watch them work. In September, Travis and I organized a trip to tackle a section of the Oklahoma Adventure Trail. This was a trail that had not been updated recently, and we'd have to reroute around damaged bridges several times throughout the state.
So here's the bridge that is out, and obviously we're not going to be able to cross this.
In October, following the success of the Central Overland Expo, James and I knew that we needed an outdoor experience for those folks. So we contacted Travis at Roman Nose State Park and he agreed we could use the park. It was a gathering, a meet and greet as it were. But in addition to our own skills, I called in some friends from scouting, and together we provided additional instruction on a variety of overlanding skills, from leave no trace to vehicle field repair to Dutch oven cooking. Then the next day we had an actual driving experience along a different section of the Oklahoma Adventure Trail than we had driven a month earlier. Beyond paying their camping fee to the park, there was no charge to participate. Later in October, I'd hear a strange noise coming from the rear differential. I pulled the drain plug, and it did not look good. Upon removing the cover, it was obvious that my rear ring and pinion gears were damaged. I contacted Tim, the mechanic I have for heavy lifting on my rig, and he hauled it off to his shop to be repaired. Then in November and December, I'd wrap up the year with another trip out to San Diego. A couple of my kids would also join me, and I would drive a lot of two-lane once again, this time taking advantage of the return of the Cranes Festival at Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge. And since I was in San Diego, Fred and I arranged another trip to Anza Borrego Desert State Park with a few new friends and Jack and his dad, who drove down from Washington.
One time this was all an alluvial plain for the Colorado River, and washing down the Colorado River was all this dirt which came from the Grand Canyon.
We drive some of the same sections I drove with Fred a couple years earlier, plus also up to Hot Springs Mountain, the San Diego high point. The funniest part was asking Jack over the radio if his dad, Nick, could drive a stick shift. I'd learned that he could, that he was a retired professional race car driver, and a two-time winner in his class at the 24 Hours of Daytona. Talk about embarrassing myself, but that wouldn't keep Nick from joining us in the future. In December, I'd have a coolant leak. That would turn out to be a bad exhaust manifold gasket. Once again, I hired Tim for that repair. It was 2016 and I had some exciting plans ahead, but the first thing up wasn't planned at all: the Death Valley Super Bloom. Overnight, I arranged for my home to be cared for, packed up the Jeep, and headed west, stopping at interesting places along the way to shoot a few photos. In Death Valley, I would meet two great fellow campers, Mitch and Doug. We'd really hit it off. I enjoyed drinking a glass or three of wine, and they needed help drinking all they had brought. During my stay, I'd drive West Side Road to the racetrack in Eureka Dunes and through Titus Canyon. Though the park was packed overflowing, it was great to see all the color after my last visit there many years before. It was a blast meeting Mitch and Doug, and we'd soon return to Death Valley for another adventure. Departing there, I stopped for breakfast at a small cafe in Shoshone and met Kevin. He'd spent more time exploring the Mojave Desert than anyone I've ever known. Next up was Matt's new Jeep Wrangler Hard Rock Edition. Matt lived in Arizona, but he found the best deal on one in OKC. So he flew into town, and we had a crew ready at James's shop to help him with the initial mods. Barely even 10 miles on the rig. We'd replace his headlights, add protective skids and paint film, install an electrical connection for ignition control power, install new bump stops to reduce sag, and a bolt kit to reduce the likelihood of death wobble. It was May, and I made a beeline for Ray's home in Washington. This was the beginning of almost every overlander's dream trip: Canada and Alaska. We didn't have a number of days planned, though we did have some very remote anchor points that we wanted to drive to. Crossing the border at Abbotsford, we'd take side trips to the coastal towns of Prince Rupert and Stewart. We'd learn from locals some of the lesser-known drives, including to Salmon Glacier, along the Neskaa Highway, the sand dunes at Carcross, and out to McLaren Glacier. I'd been advised by a National Geographic photographer I met at the Death Valley Super Bloom about the best service to experience Kenai Fjords National Park. The best individual we'd meet was Steve, a motorcyclist, who we unexpectedly met multiple times over the duration of our trip. The last time was 3 weeks after we thought he was down in Fairbanks. When we were north of the Arctic Circle, he came running up to us from a van. He'd flown up to Coldfoot, which was where we were driving, and was now getting a ride back to Fairbanks.
I don't believe it. I just flew
Of course, both Dempster and Dalton highways were in our plans. Heck, almost everywhere you could drive in Alaska was in our plans.
You know, or maybe for a couple hours, you're just, you know, down the road, and then wham, you know, you come around an oh my God corner.
We spent 44 days between leaving and returning to the lower 48. 9,450 miles driven. The experience of a lifetime. By September, Ray and I were ready for another adventure. Matt invited both of us and Chris to participate in another Utah trip. On the way, I would visit Black Kettle National Grasslands. Then, meeting in Santa Fe, Ray and I would arrive a couple days early to celebrate my birthday. We'd spend some of that time visiting local attractions, including Los Alamos and Bandelier National Monument. Once Matt and Chris arrived, we hoped to catch some fall colors as we crossed the Abajo and Henry Mountains. In 9 days, we would drive up Moki Dugway, through Bears Ears National Monument, Water Pocket Fold, the Bird Trail, Wolverine Loop, Hell's Backbone, and Croton Road to end at Big Water near Lake Powell. In December, the 4-wheel parts store in Tulsa contacted me and asked if I'd give a talk during an open house on vehicle recovery. So I loaded the overlanding jewelry onto the Wrangler and headed up that way. I expect the highlight was Dale Albright's talk, he being heavily involved in the Blue Ribbon Coalition's program to keep trails open. But the crowd did enjoy it when I demonstrated how to use a front-mounted winch to pull your rig backwards. Hint, it's going to take you a lot of line and 3 snatch blocks. Anyway, it had been a very busy 10 years with the Wrangler. I know that there were some mods done that I haven't mentioned, including sleeving and gusting the front Dana 30 axle, and replacing its axle shafts with chromoly, wiring the fender lights into the turn signal, adding a CB radio, and, due to the Alaska trip, adding some additional protection against rocks to the front of the Jeep. And there were some additional repairs, including replacing the driver's side exhaust manifold because it had a leak, replacing the alternator for a squeaky bearing, repairing a sticky brake caliper, and replacing the starter motor because sometimes it didn't spin. Repairs because of the Alcan trip included a new windshield, actually 2, one lasted only 5 days during the trip, a driving light damaged by a rock, a new muffler, which was also an aftermarket part, and catalytic converter. By this time I had about 200,000 miles on the Wrangler. There were rumors about the next generation of Wrangler, and a Wrangler-based pickup was also actively discussed, usually called the Scrambler. But while I could use a pickup and was very interested in that, I knew it could not replace my Wrangler. I was too much in love with this vehicle. Even to this day, November 2023, I'd rather be driving my Wrangler than anything else. And I also own a 2020 Gladiator and a 1979 Trans Am. But I'll save the rest of this story for the 2017 to 2023 video.